It all started with a solo hiking trip I planned last summer. I'd been saving up my vacation days and thought it would be the perfect chance to get away from the constant buzz of the city. I'd always been drawn to the idea of being out in nature where it's just you and the wilderness. I wanted peace, clarity, and maybe even a little adventure. But I had no idea how quickly that sense of excitement could turn into something much darker. The forest I chose was a few hours drive from my apartment, tucked away in a national park that wasn't very well known. It wasn't deserted though. The online reviews mentioned well-marked trails and a few visitors here and there. Perfect, I thought, just isolated enough to feel free, but not so remote that I'd have to worry about anything serious. Or so I convinced myself. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and my pocket knife. I even threw in a paperback to read by the fire, imagining myself relaxing in the quiet wilderness. Just thinking about it made me smile during the drive over. I didn't know it then, but that was the last time I'd feel at ease for the rest of the trip. When I arrived, the parking lot was practically empty, only 2 cars besides mine. At first, that felt like a good thing. I wanted solitude, after all. But as I got my backpack and locked up my car, I had this weird, brief feeling of unease. It passed quickly, probably just nerves about being alone in an unfamiliar place. I told myself to stop being dramatic and started hiking. The forest was gorgeous. Towering trees stretched endlessly into the sky, their branches filtering the sunlight into golden patches on the ground. Birds chirped, squirrels darted across the trail, and the air smelled fresh, like pine and earth. It was exactly what I'd been craving, a break from the chaos of my daily routine. With every step, I felt the tension in my body ease. By the time I reached a clearing about 8 miles in, I was actually feeling happy. Calm, even. The clearing felt perfect for a campsite. It was just off the trail, surrounded by dense trees, but open enough to see the sky. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and ate dinner as the sun started to dip. That first night, I fell asleep easily to the sound of crickets and owls, wrapped up in the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The second day, I woke up feeling energized. After breakfast, I decided to explore further off the trail. I left most of my gear behind, taking just a small backpack with water, snacks, and my knife. I wanted to see more of the forest, maybe find a stream or a nice spot to sit and just exist for a while. A couple of hours later, I found that stream. It was picturesque, winding gently through the trees with sunlight glinting off the water. I followed it for a bit, enjoying the sound of rushing water. But then I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a hiking boot, lying on its side near the edge of the stream. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual. People lose things in the woods all the time, right? But as I got closer, my stomach twisted. The boot wasn't just old, it was torn to shreds. The leather was jagged, like something with claws had ripped it apart. I stared at it, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was that it was probably animals. Maybe some hiker had left it behind and wildlife had gotten to it. That explanation made sense until I noticed the other stuff nearby. A piece of green fabric, torn and hanging from a bush. A dented tin cup, rusted and smashed, lying a few feet away. My chest tightened as I stood there, piecing it all together. Someone had been here. Someone had lost their boot, their jacket, their gear. But why? And why did everything look so violent? The peacefulness I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. I told myself it was nothing, just some hiker who'd had a rough time. But I couldn't shake the pit forming in my stomach. Something about the scene felt wrong, and the more I looked at it, the worse I felt. I decided to head back to my campsite after that. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting, I don't know what, but every time I turned, there was nothing there, just the empty forest, silent and still. By the time I reached my campsite, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. I tried to shake off the anxiety, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Still, I couldn't stop glancing at the trees, feeling like there were eyes on me. I got a fire going, hoping it would make me feel safer. But then I noticed something that made my heart drop. One of the ropes securing my tent had come loose. That wouldn't have been a big deal, except the rope hadn't just come undone, it had been cut. The edge was clean, like someone had taken a knife to it. Panic hit me like a wave. I spun around, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anything. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my knife and sat by the fire, trying to convince myself there was some other explanation. Maybe the rope had frayed, maybe I'd tied it wrong. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night was the longest of my life. I sat by the fire, gripping my knife, my ears straining for every sound. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind my tent. My throat tightened and my hands started to sweat. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The footsteps stopped and the forest went silent again. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just stared into the darkness, feeling like at any second something or someone would step into the light of the fire. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother eating breakfast or breaking camp properly. I just grabbed what I could and started hiking back to the trailhead as fast as I could. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed, but every time I looked back, there was nothing there, just the endless trees. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I threw my stuff in the trunk, got in, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Back in the summer of 2016, I was stuck in this dead-end warehouse job, the kind where you clock in, clock out, and feel like you're just going through the motions. I was saving up money, but for what? I didn't know. My life felt like it was on autopilot, and I was suffocating in the monotony of it all. That's when my buddy Jay invited me on a camping trip to this forest about 2 hours outside the city. He pitched it as the perfect escape. "You need this, man," he told me. "No work, no stress, just us, the fire, and the stars." I wasn't the outdoorsy type. My idea of a break was binging video games in my apartment with greasy pizza and an energy drink. But Jay was relentless. "You'll feel better," he kept saying, and eventually I caved. He had this way of making everything sound like an adventure. We left on a Friday evening, his old truck rattling down the highway with tents, sleeping bags, and a cooler full of beer and steaks in the back. The drive was almost nostalgic. Windows down, music cranked up, laughing at stupid inside jokes. For a moment, I felt like maybe this trip wasn't such a bad idea. By the time we got there, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest bathed in shadows. I remember stepping out of the truck and feeling how quiet it was. Not eerie at that point, just peaceful. Jay seemed right at home, guiding us to this clearing about half a mile into the woods. The spot was remote. No cell service, no other campers, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. At first, it was perfect. We set up our tents, got a fire going, and spent the next couple of hours grilling, drinking, and reminiscing. Jay was the kind of guy who could make you laugh until your stomach hurt, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Around midnight, Jay called it a night, stumbling into his tent with the kind of carefree confidence I envied. I stayed up for a bit, staring at the fire as it cracked and popped, feeling the kind of calm I hadn't felt in ages. But as the flames died down and the darkness crept closer, something shifted. The quiet that had felt peaceful before now felt wrong. Too quiet. It's hard to explain unless you've experienced it. Like the forest had swallowed every sound. No crickets, no wind, nothing. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe the beer was messing with me. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to shake this weird unease. And then I heard it. Footsteps. At first I thought it was Jay. Maybe he was up, fumbling around outside, but these weren't casual footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, heavy, and they weren't coming from his tent. They were circling ours. My heart started pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there could hear it. I wanted to call out to Jay, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. I just lay there, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps stopped, then started again. It was like whoever or whatever it was knew we were inside and was toying with us. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped completely. I waited. 10 minutes? 20? I don't know. Finally, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was still smoldering, casting faint light over the clearing, but there was nothing there. No one. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, my hands shaking, telling myself it had to be an animal. A deer, maybe. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The way those footsteps sounded, it was too human. The rest of the night was a blur of paranoia. Every little sound made me jump. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted. When I told Jay about it, he laughed it off. "You're just not used to the woods, man. Your mind's playing tricks on you." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. So I pushed it to the back of my mind and tried to enjoy the day. We spent Saturday hiking, grilling, and just hanging out. By the time night rolled around, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But when darkness fell, the unease crept back in. It started again just after midnight. Jay and I were sitting by the fire talking about nothing in particular when we both froze. The footsteps were back, slow, heavy, and getting closer. Jay's face went pale. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my throat dry. The footsteps circled us just outside the light of the fire. I felt like my chest was being squeezed. Every instinct in my body was screaming, "Danger!" Jay grabbed a flashlight, his hand trembling as he shone it into the darkness. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. No response. The footsteps stopped. We sat there, holding our breath, until a loud crack shattered the silence. It sounded like a branch snapping, followed by the sound of something running, fast. Jay and I jumped up, grabbing whatever we could. I had a pocket knife, and he picked up a heavy branch. We stood back to back, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. "Let's get out of here," Jay muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't argue. We packed up as fast as we could, our movements frantic and clumsy. The hike back to the truck was the longest half-mile of my life. Every twig snap, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. We didn't talk. We didn't stop. We just kept moving, terrified of what might be following us. When we finally reached the truck, we threw our gear in the back and sped off, not saying a word until we were miles away. We never figured out what or who was out there. An animal? A person? I don't know, but I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will. I've always loved the outdoors. Hiking, camping, fishing, anything that gets me away from the noise of the city. It's my way of recharging. I'm the kind of guy who enjoys solitude, so I usually go alone. I know people say that's not smart, but I've been doing it for years without any issues. That is, until this trip. It was mid-September, and the weather was perfect. Cool but not cold, sunny with a light breeze. I decided to try a trail I'd been eyeing for months. It's one of those lesser-known ones, not marked on most maps. No signs, no maintenance, just raw, untouched forest. That's what I liked about it. The idea of being out there completely alone always felt freeing. Peaceful. I parked my car at the little dirt pull-off by the trailhead, threw on my backpack, and started walking. The forest was dense but beautiful. The kind of place where the trees are so tall and close together that it feels like the world outside doesn't exist. Just me, the trail, and nature. The first couple of hours were uneventful. I passed a small stream, stopped to eat a sandwich, and took a few pictures. The silence out there wasn't unsettling. It was calming, like the forest was giving me a hug. I didn't see a single person, which wasn't unusual for a trail like this. That's exactly why I'd chosen it. But around the 3-hour mark, something changed. I don't know how to describe it, but I started to feel off. Like there was a weight in my chest I couldn't shake. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired, but it didn't feel like that. It was like my body knew something before my brain did. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me. Of course, the trail was empty, nothing but trees and shadows. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd been alone too long and my mind was playing tricks on me. But no matter how much I reasoned with myself, the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. That's when I saw the footprints. They were in the dirt, just off the trail. Fresh. My stomach tightened. They definitely weren't mine. The tread didn't match my boots. They were heading in the same direction I was, but I hadn't seen anyone ahead of me. That didn't make sense. I stopped and looked around, my heart pounding in my ears. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful earlier, now felt like it was closing in on me. I scanned the trees, expecting to see someone step out from behind a trunk or bush, but it was just empty. Still, my gut wouldn't let it go. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, but I didn't want to. I'd driven all this way, planned this whole day, and now some stupid footprints were going to scare me off? I told myself I was being ridiculous and started walking again. But with every step, that heaviness in my chest grew. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe, and the silence. God, the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I'd felt earlier. This was different. No birds, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps, too loud in the stillness. I forced myself to keep going, but when I hit the halfway point back to my car, I couldn't take it anymore. My stomach was in knots, my skin crawling. It felt like something was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. And then I saw him. He was standing on the trail about 50 feet ahead of me, perfectly still. My first thought was that he was just another hiker, but something about him immediately felt wrong. He wasn't wearing hiking gear, just a dirty jacket and jeans. His face was partly hidden by a baseball cap, but I could see enough to know he wasn't smiling. My heart dropped. I stopped dead in my tracks, every muscle in my body tensing. I wanted to call out to him, to ask if he needed help, but my throat felt dry and tight. All I could do was stare. Finally, I forced myself to speak, my voice shaky. "Hey!" He didn't respond. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, but it felt like forever. My legs felt like lead, my chest tight with fear. I thought about turning around, but the idea of heading deeper into the woods made my stomach turn. I decided to just walk past him. I don't know why I thought that was a good idea, but I couldn't stand there forever. As I got closer, I noticed something in his hand. A knife. Not a hunting knife, not a survival knife, just a plain kitchen knife. The blade was shiny, like it was brand new. My brain screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I managed to say, my voice shaking. He didn't respond, didn't blink, just stared. I started backing up, my eyes locked on him. That's when I noticed something else. Footprints. Fresh ones. Not his, not mine. Someone else had been here, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me, I spun around so fast I nearly fell. There was no one there, just trees and shadows. When I turned back, the man was gone. Gone. I didn't think. I just ran. I don't remember much about the run back to my car except the way my lungs burned and how every sound made me want to scream. I felt like I was being hunted. When I reached my car, I nearly cried with relief. But when I saw what was waiting for me, my stomach dropped. A small piece of paper was tucked under my windshield wiper. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to grab it. It had just 3 words on it. "Don't come back." I jumped in the car, locked the doors, and tore out of there so fast I nearly hit a tree. I don't know who that guy was or what he wanted. I don't want to know. I haven't been back to that trail, or any trail, since.